Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on asking about gender, confronting assumptions, and challenging transphobias. My name is Trevor Temchak, and I'm with the Human Services and Justice Coordinating Committee. I just have a few housekeeping items before we begin. We will have a Q&A period at the end of the webinar. However, you can ask questions as we go by typing them in the Q&A box during the discussion, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slides and other resources will be emailed to you following the webinar. The webinar will also be posted on YouTube, and the slides will be available on the HSJCC website. There will also be a short survey sent out at the end of the webinar, and we would love to hear feedback from you. About the HSJCC network, we're a network comprised of 38 local committees, 14 regional committees, and 1 provincial committee. We're a volunteer collaboration between the health and social service organizations, community mental health and addiction organizations, and partners from the justice sector, including Crown attorneys, judges, police services, and correctional service providers. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our presenters, Katie and Rebecca, and they can introduce themselves.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Katie Rogers. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Knowledge Exchange Director at Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange, or YouthREX. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Rebecca Johnson, Research and Evaluation Associate at YouthREX. Rebecca's pronouns are she, her. We're really grateful for the opportunity to share space with everyone today to begin the work of confronting assumptions about gender and challenging transphobia in our work with youth. As many of you will know, anti-queer and anti-trans protests have been planned today across the country to protest against LGBTQ+ inclusive content in schools, and also against the fundamental human rights of queer and trans people under the guise of championing parental rights. Peaceful counter-protests are also happening across Canada to disrupt hate and division and to support queer and trans people of all ages. So before we begin our presentation today, we want to emphasize our solidarity with today's counter-protests, and also that there is no space for hate in our work with youth. We meet youth where they are at, and we support their self-determination.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie. So just to share a bit about YouthREX, our vision is of an Ontario where shared knowledge is transformed into positive impact for all youth. And we aspire to this through our commitment to making research, evidence, and evaluation accessible and relevant to Ontario's youth sector. And we do this through knowledge exchange, capacity building, and evaluation leadership. And just to briefly touch on these 3 areas of our work, our knowledge exchange activities includes opportunities like today when we can come together as stakeholders from across the youth sector to share knowledge, gain insights, and to expand our understandings. And it also includes the curation and creation of resources that connect shared knowledge to youth work practice. And as one of the tools that YouthREX uses to facilitate this knowledge exchange, we have our Knowledge Hub, which hosts over 2,000 resources, and you can access this on YouthREX's website, and maybe we can share that link in the chat, and we encourage you to check that out. We also provide capacity building opportunities, and these are led by our amazing Learn team at YouthREX, and they lead programming and host an online platform called Learn by YouthREX, and we can share that link as well. And this features online certificates and workshops where folks in the youth sector can come together to learn new skills, build capacity, connect with their peers across the sector. We also have our research and evaluation work, which includes customized evaluation support services. And YouthREX has developed a 7-step evaluation framework, and we use this framework to guide our approach to customized evaluation supports, which we offer for free to youth programs across Ontario. So in practice, that can look different depending on the needs of the program that we work with. It may be offering guidance on program evaluation or helping to build team capacity around the design and development and evaluation of your program. And again, these services are free. So if we can be of support to you, we encourage you to get in touch with us. And then lastly, we have our newest area of our work, which is our community engaged research projects. And we've just launched our first research project, the Ontario Youth Sector Compass. We launched this in 2021, and it'll be wrapping up soon. But this project aimed to get a pulse on the youth sector, the needs and the experiences of youth through engaging with young people and youth workers. Perfect. And next, I want to introduce an important partner in the creation of the Asking About Gender Toolkit, LGBT YouthLine, and they are a 2S LGBTQ plus youth-led organization that affirms and supports youth across Ontario. And their vision is to see youth of all sexual and gender identities be celebrated and supported. And to do this, they provide several wonderful supports and services, including anonymous peer support and referrals through their peer support helpline. And they offer training for youth to provide support to their peers. And they also offer a library of rich resources so that youth can make informed decisions.
Thank you. So why are we here? Something that we see a lot in our work at YouthREX is the demographic survey. And that is a data collection tool that's used for registration or intake, and it is often used in program evaluation. And the demographic survey ostensibly helps programs know who they are serving and whether they're reaching the right people. And these surveys will ask a variety of questions such as age, location, gender, sexual orientation, race, income, or educational attainment. And no doubt at one time or another, all of you will have encountered one of these surveys. But what we've realized in our work with youth programs is that these surveys often become a site of a common paradox in the social services sector, one with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, that the people that are most in need of our programming are also generally the least likely to receive the appropriate care that they need. So most youth programs, for example, they exist because of an unfulfilled need of some kind. And in the context of systemic oppression, need is distributed unevenly. So in particular, those who are experiencing marginalization by virtue of their race, their class, gender, ability, sexual orientation, or any other human-made system, they're disproportionately burdened by unmet needs. And systemic oppression organizes our access and our opportunity so that those who are non-white, poor or low income, queer, trans, two-spirit or non-binary, neurodivergent, or physically divergent, they're more likely to have unmet needs and therefore more likely to access our services. But systemic oppression is so deeply embedded in our systems of relating to one another that it also tends to inform how we engage in the work of meeting needs. And so we're often relying on and reproducing this oppressive logic. And one of the ways the logic shows up is in our demographic surveys. The way that we ask questions in order to know who our participants are, they're often reflecting problematic assumptions. And these assumptions implicate us in causing harm, even in our efforts to compensate for harm and to meet needs. And from YouthREX's work in this area, we've realized that in particular, the demographic question on gender is one of the more overtly and ubiquitously problematic questions. And so together with our partner, LGBT YouthLine, we developed the Asking About Gender Toolkit to point out the issues in this commonly used demographic survey question and to provide an alternative. And so really, we are using the demographic survey question as an entry point into confronting assumptions about gender to provide what we consider to be an inclusive gender menu as an alternative, and also to sort of think about how we can more proactively challenge transphobia in our work. I think I mentioned the paradox and explained a little bit of context around that. And so we're here really to do three things in summary. We want to understand gender and its common misconceptions. We want to understand and challenge transphobia in our work with young people. And, we want to introduce to you all this toolkit that we've developed and the inclusive gender menu as resources that may support your work with youth clients or youth program participants.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie. And just before we venture into this important topic, we want to offer some tips to inform how we approach the discussion or reminders which can guide us and they'll hopefully help us to maximize the benefits that we can all gain in exploring the content of today's webinar. So in framing today's discussion, we invite you to be here to unlearn gender rigidity rather than to learn gender diversity. And we say this because it helps us to make visible the pervasive lifelong learning of socialization into problematic and limited gender norms, which often become invisible because of that. So we've spent our life learning about gender in this way. And so we come to this with a dominant way of knowing, which we often assume to be common sense or reflective of our reality. But by framing ourselves within a state of unlearning, we can make this more visible and open ourselves to interrogating and challenging our gender socialization. And with this webinar, the toolkit and the discussions we're having today, they're just one part of a truly continuous process. And we want to acknowledge and emphasize that undoing the harms associated with existing within gender norms for our whole life, this is a lifelong project. It requires internal self-reflection and external advocacy. So we want to remind folks that this is just a step in that journey. It's not an endpoint. The creation of this toolkit and the inclusive gender menu is our attempt to account for and respond accurately and appropriately to the folks we work with in all of their gender diversity. But we want to frame this with the important distinction that this attempt is not doing a favor. It's in fact making available to everyone the care and respect we're all entitled to, and that which many folks who generally conform to normative standards already receive. So these actions we're taking are simply an act of justice. We also want to bring awareness as we engage in this critical self-reflection that the gender rules by which we were socialized impose on us powerful limitations on the way we express ourselves and relate to one another. So through this unlearning, this reflective process, we're helping ourselves, regardless of how or to what extent we do or do not conform to gender norms or expectations. We're opening possibility and opportunities by unpacking dominant ideas of gender. So through this understanding, we want to acknowledge that this serves ourselves through this unlearning process. And lastly, even though it's important to make our demographic surveys accurate and inclusive, we should also be questioning why it's such a normal thing in our sector to be collecting so much personal data on the people we're serving. So this aims at the micro level reflections within our practice, but also the larger considerations within our sector. So often our clients, as Katie mentioned, are accessing our services out of necessity and an unmet need that they can't access within the private sector, where there it's less likely or common to be asked this additional burden in responding to questions, or especially detailed questions about who they are. So we need to critically be reflective of what purpose these questions serve, whether these questions help us to serve our clients better. So in the development of this toolkit, the gender inclusive menu, we realized that while our efforts to make demographic surveys more accurate and inclusive is important, we're actually entrenching a problematic system of surveillance on clients where it's problematic, a problematic norm to be asked detailed questions in the first place. So we want to be candid about the risks of reform when what is really needed is revolution, and to be reforming our systems to make them less harmful, at the same time continues to legitimize and embed ourselves within a system that's fundamentally harmful. So in saying this, we share an understanding in which we're not saying we shouldn't ever engage in reform activities, because this toolkit was developed out of acknowledging a need, and we do believe in that revising the demographic surveys is important. But at the same time, we want to bring attention to the limitations of reform, and bringing consciousness to the notion that our reform activities shouldn't compromise our place moving forward towards revolution. It's not quite one or the other, but we're taking a harm reduction approach in this way.
So, what is the problem with gender? I talked a little bit earlier about these oppressive social systems that pre-exist our organizations but continue to inform our work. And one of those systems is gender. Gender is hegemonic, which means that it is a dominant force in our society. And one of the features of hegemony is that gender is so written into our norms and operations that we don't even really notice it. When you think about all that we know about what gender is and how it is relevant to our lives and our expectations of how we and others should be, most of us really can't even define it. So really, gender as hegemonic refers to its function as both pervasive and also invisible. The problem with gender is that it so thoroughly dictates our lives and our expectations around how others should be and what they should do, but we rarely consciously or rigorously engage with it.
Great. So as Katie mentioned, we're so entrenched in the system of gender. There's this important element of invisibility. And one of the steps we can take in dislodging this hegemony, this normative dominating influence, is by naming it. So we're going to start there, asking the question, what is gender? And the definition we have here, gender is an aspect of personal identity associated with social norms and expectations. And there are some important features that help us to better understand and explore gender. So the first aspect of gender we want to highlight is that gender is far-reaching. It informs how we identify, how we present ourselves, how we relate to one another, interpersonally, institutionally, and within society. And it informs how we spend our days and how we occupy space. Gender is also unstable. It's evolving. It's socially produced and sustained, and it's context specific. So gender right here and right now looks very different than it did years ago, or how it will in the future, and also how it looks in different parts of the world as well. And gender is also limiting. As a socially constructed set of rules and guidelines, we're often nudged in certain directions while at the same time experiencing barriers to spaces that are outside of these quote unquote rules. But at the same time, gender, in our last point here, can also be liberating because it provides a framework for self-expression. So gender is something we identify with, we self-declare. For example, I am a girl, but at the same time, it's also something that's imposed upon us. For example, early in life, we're assigned gender at birth, and then throughout our lives, others have assumptions of our gender based on visual cues. People have expectations about what we do or what we should do based on their understanding of our gender. So it's important to break down and interrogate commonly held assumptions about gender, which can create a disconnect between how we understand ourselves as gendered beings and how others relate to us on the basis of gender.
So we want to share with you an example of a common demographic question. And this conversation is really exploring the problematic assumptions about gender that are contained within this sort of very simple and seemingly benign question about gender. And, we talked about the difference between gender as imposed and gender as self-identified. Demographic menus are such a space where we give youth the opportunity to share their gender, but we are potentially literally confining them to boxes on a form. And this gender menu specifically, this example we're sharing, it reflects and reproduces assumptions about gender that do not necessarily align with how many people experience it for themselves. So this type of question can deny reality, perpetuate harm, and also yields inaccurate results, whether we're using the question on a registration or intake form or in our program evaluation or our research. So this is what we are attempting to address in partnership with LGBT YouthLine in developing this toolkit asking about gender. And so we're going to introduce you to its content by reviewing the 5 problematic assumptions about gender that are really written into this question that we're sharing with you now, a very common demographic question about gender. So assumption number 1 is that gender equals sex or sex equals gender. So male and female are often conflated with gender because of our convention for assigning gender to people based on their visible anatomy at birth. Sex is actually also not a binary. People exist between the 2 poles of male and female, but nonetheless, gender is a socially produced and sustained set of behaviors, performances, and roles that are actually unrelated to biology. So conflating the 2 is not only inaccurate, but it also undermines the personhood of those without a socially validated alignment between their gender and sex. And that would include two-spirit, trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming folks. Many people have asked us why we included the term intersex on our inclusive gender menu. We recognize that intersex is also officially a biological term, but the inclusion of intersex within our gender menu also reflects its status as a gender identity. Some folks do identify with intersex as their gender, and our gender menu allows for the selection of more than one option, should those folks also or alternatively identify as a man, woman, non-binary, or another gender. So including intersex as a gender identity affirms that reality and also reflects its marginalized status and the desire for people to claim intersex as central to their personhood or experience. Gender is a human-produced system, so there are no absolutes with respect to gender, and norms and best practices are always changing and contested. And this is something important to be mindful of when implementing an inclusive gender menu with your youth clients or program participants. Moving on to assumption number 2, you can either be a man or a woman. This gender is not an inevitable biological fact. There are actually an infinite number of options beyond the man and woman binary. Mainstream gender rules are maintained through our collective participation in them. And while there is nothing wrong with subscribing to them for ourselves, we must allow for others to circumvent them. So failing to include non-binary gender options invalidates those who exist outside of or even beyond the binary. And it limits all of us really in questioning, exploring, and expanding our relationship to sex and gender. Assumption number 3, trans is a distinct and comprehensive gender identity. We often see this on gender menus. But trans and other gender categories are actually not mutually exclusive. So while man and woman refer to a person's gender identity, trans can actually refer to a person's gender journey. So the process through which they have arrived at their gender identity. It's entirely possible and often common for a person to identify as trans as well as man, woman, or another gender. And trans youth are routinely subject to the denial of their genders, which is a form of violence that undermines their well-being and safety. And it contradicts a basic principle of respect, the expectation really that we all have, regardless of our gender identity, to be referred to accurately and appropriately. So implying that trans cannot coexist with other gender options perpetuates this form of gender denial. Assumption number 4, cis is normal. The failure to include cis alongside trans suggests that identifying as cis is normal. Many of us know that trans refers to a person who does not identify with the sex and or gender they were assigned at birth, but fewer of us are familiar with the term cis, which is the state of identifying with the sex and or gender you were assigned at birth. When something is designated as the norm or the default, often we collectively fail to notice it. So trans people are expected to come out about their gender identity, but there is no expectation for cis people to come out. And this is one of the ways that privilege manifests, like through invisibility or the failure to notice what is considered to be the norm. framing cis as the default perpetuates the notion that being anything else is different. And this others youth who identify as trans, non-conforming, and non-binary, and it reinforces the limitations of dominant gender norms, the norms that make it difficult or even dangerous for any of us to express ourselves beyond the sex gender binary. And assumption number 5, that Western sex and gender frameworks are neutral and adequate. They are not universal. Humans across time and space have had a multitude of ways for conceptualizing of and engaging with their sex and their gender. A tactic and effect of colonialism and imperialism has been the imposition of Western ways of knowing and being onto subjugated populations. And one of the foundational tasks of the Canadian settler colonial project was the disciplining of Indigenous gender and sexual practices that did not conform to European standards of heterosexuality, cis-binary gender, and monogamy. And since 1990, the term Two-Spirit has been used by many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island to identify their gender and/or sexual identity and their roles within communities. The term was actually first introduced by Elder Myra Laramie, who had a vision prior to the 1990 annual Intertribal Native American First Nations Gay and Lesbian American Conference. It's important for us to know, though, that being Two-Spirit is a fluid identity and that individuals, communities, and nations may have their own understandings, teachings, and languages. But failing to include Two-Spirit in the gender menu is an act of colonial erasure. It sustains the authority of Western sex gender frameworks while failing to acknowledge the sovereignty of Indigenous communities and defining their own personhood and relationality. The last point that we want to make about these 5 assumptions is that all of us are harmed by a dominant approach to gender, but we really want to emphasize that those who are not able to abide by the dominant rules are the ones who are most immediately and explicitly harmed. And we want to name that those folks are Two-Spirit, trans, gender nonconforming, and gender non-binary people.
Wonderful, thanks, Katie. And just before we get into sharing about the gender menu that we've created as an alternative to this, we want to talk about and delve into transphobia, what this is, what it looks like, the impacts, and what we can do to challenge it. So transphobia is defined as the collection of ideas and behaviors that incite and justify personal and structural violence against trans and other non-normatively gendered people. And these ideas and behaviors uphold negative perceptions of transness, of gender non-normativity, and also of any deviation from binary gender rules. And it's helpful to examine and reflect on the different ways in which transphobia manifests at the different registers of society, probably in a lot of ways that we may already recognize, and some that are harder to recognize or may be more invisible. And we have a non-exhaustive list of examples here, and we'll briefly go through them. So culturally, transphobia manifests through gender reveal parties and the culturally held expectation, as Katie mentioned, to come out. And interpersonally, transphobia can look like misgendering, bullying, hate crimes, and eviction or disowning from family. Institutionally, transphobia manifests through binary gendered washrooms, gendered quote unquote therapy, underemployment, the lack of appropriate service and care, for example, within healthcare, shelters, and other social services. Legally and politically, transphobia is seen in the lag in mandated protections for trans folks and things like a lack of adequate funding for confirmation surgeries. Economically, trans people face disproportionate levels of poverty and housing discrimination. And transphobia manifests through the ways and the degree to which trans folks are represented. For example, trans people lack positions of visibility and authority, and transphobia can manifest through representation in television and movies, in media, through the tragic or perverse depictions of transness. And as an outcome of these experiences and the pervasiveness of transphobia, trans and folks who do or cannot subscribe to dominant normative gender binary experience worse outcomes in psychological, physical, social, and economic well-being than their cisgendered counterparts. And this has been found in various research studies. But with this, it's really important to know and really emphasize that the distinction that these outcomes are not attributable to transness itself, but entirely as a result of transphobia, and that there's nothing wrong, pathological or tragic about transness and non-normity in and of itself. And that this is entirely the result of transphobia. I just want to say again and emphasize. And lastly, we'll touch on intersectionality. So intersectionality is a critical lens to take when wanting to understand in an accurate and holistic way how transphobia operates and impacts people. So intersectionality is a method of analysis that asks us to consider a person's social categorizations, things like race, ability, class, gender, sexual orientation, etc. And it asks us to examine these together with one another rather than separately. And this is because oppression and privilege within different categories, they interact uniquely and produce outcomes that are different and greater than the sum of their parts. So intersectionality asks us to look at how the specificities of all of these categorizations interact with another. So to help us dive into this a bit, we can look at an example of how the intersections for folks who experience marginalization on the basis of gender and class, how these identities interact with one another. So the effects of interpersonal and structural transphobia, as we heard before, contribute to trans people being more likely to live in poverty, specifically more likely to experience family alienation, which often renders trans and non-normative people homeless or without economic support. To experience psychological distress that can create barriers to employment and discrimination in employment. And then conversely, poverty exacerbates the effects of transphobic discrimination because actualizing one's gender identity within a capitalist context almost always requires economic means. For example, being able to buy new clothes through an expression of gender or makeup to afford chest binders, having decent work or economic security, that it requires having decent work or an economic security. For example, to be able to take off time for gender confirmation surgery. So all of this requires some level of economic security. And it's not enough for us to consider that someone who is, in this example we're using, experiencing or facing poverty and trans, how they're burdened by both forms of oppression. We have to consider how poverty is an effect of transphobia and how the effect of transphobic discrimination exacerbates poverty or is exacerbated by poverty. So to continue to understand the importance of examining transphobia through this intersectional lens, another example we could look at is transphobia and patriarchy, how those intersect to produce particularly negative depictions of trans femininity and to particularly expose trans femmes and trans women to violence. And we see this manifest through the fact that trans women are statistically more victimized by hate crimes and violence as compared to trans men. Now, these are just two examples, and they only scratch the surface, but we want to emphasize that to understand the depth and the extensiveness of transphobia, we have to account for these nuances and these intersections. And also then that effectively dismantling transphobia necessitates our active engagement and commitment in the struggle against poverty, against racism, ableism, and so forth. Perfect. And challenging transphobia requires a constant interrogation of the assumptions, the beliefs, and the norms and the behaviors that reproduce, sustain, and enforce the rules of dominant gender hegemony. And some of the ways we can challenge transphobia could be by asking someone's pronouns, and through the understanding that this act is not an exercise, but it's an expression of humility. It shows that we recognize that we don't know how someone may identify, and that if we assume, this can be harmful and is often insufficient. But in the way that this webinar or the reform of gender menus is not the endpoint of the journey, neither is the practice of asking for folks' pronouns. So instead, what we can do is incorporate these micro examples into a more broader understanding of how to engage with humility and with respect.
So we want to share with you the example of the inclusive gender menu that YouthREX co-developed with LGBT YouthLine. And then we'll kind of sort of go over how this gender menu speaks back to the assumptions, challenges the assumptions, and challenges transphobia in the ways that we've spoken about that today. And maybe we can share in the chat box if we haven't already linked to the toolkit asking about gender, and also a specific link to this inclusive gender menu that can be found on YouthREX's Knowledge Hub. So here we have the question, what is your gender? Young people are given the opportunity to select all that apply. The options that we provide are boy, man, girl, woman, cisgender, intersex, non-binary, non-conforming, transgender, two-spirit for Indigenous people, questioning, exploring, prefer not to answer, I don't know, or I identify with another gender, with the option to write in gender identity. So how does this gender menu address the assumption? Again, it recognizes there's a distinction between sex and gender. So it replaces male, female with boy, man, and girl, woman. This menu also acknowledges that gender exists beyond the binary, and it adds the options of non-conforming and non-binary. It recognizes that gender categories are not mutually exclusive by asking the young person to select all that apply. And it undoes cis as a default by including cis as an option. Furthermore, it is recognizing the non-exhaustiveness of Western sex and gender frameworks by including two-spirit as an option, and also recognizing that that is an option that is exclusive to Indigenous peoples. The menu also recognizes gender's infinite possibilities by including an option for a young person to write in their gender identity. That also reflects, as we previously discussed, the need to integrate humility into our work, and it recognizes the non-universality of gender by offering definitions. So if you actually look at the resource, the full resource we've developed, that resource includes definitions so that the person who is facilitating asking the question, whether again on a registration or intake form or through research or evaluation, can use the menu as a way to engage young people in conversations around the definitions for these terms, again, recognizing that norms and definitions change over time, and that this is a menu that will need to evolve going forward. We are ready, I think, to open it up to questions. We wanted to keep our presentation brief so that we would have time to respond. With the caveat, of course, like Rebecca and I are here as allies in our work at YouthREX, and we will, answer questions with humility and authenticity. And if we're not able to answer a question, we will let you know. But yeah, we appreciate this time, and we're excited to move into this portion of the program.
Thank you. And yes, we have a Q&A box for people to type in questions. And we actually, for a change, got questions ahead of the webinar, in fact, which shows how interested people were. So I'll start with a couple of those while people use the Q&A box. One question that we had to do with, I'd love to hear thoughts, discussion on how to use gender inclusive language while not triggering respondents who disagree with gender diversity, because they've experienced sometimes hostile responses in the past. So how would you sort of balance that, if you do balance that?
We're both waiting for the other to jump in, and we don't want to we don't want to speak over one another. Rebecca, do you want to go first?
I think my first thought, and I'll let you jump in, Katie, please add on. I think one thing that I just want to emphasize is that I would just say, as a service provider, it is our job to set the standard of safety and inclusion. And I guess that means in some ways having this pushback. I'm not sure, that's not an answer of how to maybe deal with that, or other ways. If Katie, you want to add on.
Yeah, I think I would lean into the idea of using that as an opportunity to call people in, maybe not calling them out, but calling them into recognizing that this is about self-determination. And so while the gender binary may work for some folks may identify firmly as a boy or a man, or a girl or a woman, that we have to accept people for who they are and how they show up, and accept the ways in which they express their gender identity. So making space for everyone to come to that determination on their own, and emphasizing the importance of humility, and also the importance of creating safety by allowing for that self-determination. Again, those are not sort of detailed practices, but in terms of thinking about how to approach that, we started today's presentation from an understanding that young people are able to determine their gender and will express to us who they are, and that we will accept them for who they are and where they're at. And I think hopefully that helps to frame how we approach the issue. And I would hope that program spaces could also do that work of setting that context and creating that safe and inclusive space.
Thank you. And just to answer one of the questions that came up, all of these links will be available after the presentation. So not to worry about that. We will send them out to everyone and post them on our website as well. One of the questions that came up in the Q&A is with the menu that you have offered up, and I wondered about it. Transgender being an option. It says select all that applied. Wondering about transgender being listed exclusively. And because I don't think about I'm just adding to the question, just so you know. I'm not trying to put words in the person's mouth, but the fact that it's a very broad use of the word transgender in a way, because it certainly covers more than one option to me. So I guess that's why you have select all that apply. Would that be?
Yes, exactly, Trevor. That is it. That is exactly why we have select all that apply, so that if someone identifies as transgender, they can also indicate another gender identity that they also identify with. And cisgender is also listed as an option, so that I myself identify as a cisgender woman, and so that I would have the option to select those two choices on a gender menu to affirm how I identify.
And then I'm going to go to one of the other questions that we had in advance. And again, I'm fascinated by the fact that there was so much interest that we had advanced questions. And this is one of those kind of loaded questions, but what do you say when someone says that trans people don't exist, that they're just confused, or it's a phase?
I mean,
And you don't
I
want to
would,
step on each other with answering it, but
I know, again, no, I mean, again, I think there's space to push back by calling in and opening up space for confronting that assumption in the ways that we've tried to do so today, in language that is appropriate for your setting and appropriate for the folks with whom you're working. I think that, one question I remember we had, on the one hand, we say that gender identity is fluid, but then someone asked us, well, if gender identity is fluid, then why is there why is it not possible to send my trans child to a gender affirming camp and have them come home as cisgendered? And I think our response to that is that, gender identity is fluid, but it is about self-determination. Like that is the key. It is about a person telling you who they are. And it's not about other people deciding for that person who they are.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know maybe that I don't mean to be reductive about the question, but I think the self-determination piece, in the context of the fact that we do want to recognize fluidity, people's gender identity may change over the course of their life, and that we affirm who a person is in our work with them at that time and in the ways that they tell us who they are and they determine who they are for themselves.
Let's see. When a gender diverse menu is used in a survey, what could this data support and how would it influence services are provided and inclusive?
That's a really great question, Katie. I'm going to lean on you again for thinking of this one.
Sometimes, I mean, this is probably something that you can speak more to, Rebecca. Like, if you have 10 young people in a program and you ask this question, you're going to get more than 10 results, or more than 10 answers, I should say, because people can select all that apply. And then how do you represent that data? Which is not exactly the question, but I think kind of associated with that idea of, and I think using then that report to demonstrate or to understand, as norms change, as our language around gender continues to evolve through people's lived realities and experiences, perhaps you'll learn from the write-in option another gender identity that you need to include in the menu. But yeah, I think it will tell you more accurately who your participants are and allow you to then assess how your programs or services may or may not be designed to be inclusive for that population of young people. And I don't know, Rebecca, you probably also have a sense of this from our evaluation work, like how the data feeds into a loop of improving service.
Yeah, for sure. I think when you're able to more inclusively identify who is coming to your program, who and their experiences, I think a big part of including these and being able to respond to an inclusive gender menu is being able to identify perhaps trans folks who are coming to your program aren't having the same experience, and you're able to then use that to reflect on, or maybe even they're telling you more within the survey, depends what questions you're asking, and to really use that as a reflection and into their experience and how that connects to the program, if there are changes that could be made to make the program more inclusive. Of course, those type of things would depend on your programs and being specific, but really gives you insight into the different experiences based on someone's gender and whether your program is responding or including folks in the same way and having different experiences. I hope that helps to answer.
And can I just add something else, Trevor, just very quickly? Something that we also know through our work is that there's often there is often a desire within a program space to implement more inclusive gender menus, but then you're reporting back to funders that may have more narrow categories. And so something that we've been doing with LGBT YouthLine is also advocating to youth program funders to start to interrogate, not only how they ask the question, but as Rebecca pointed to earlier in the conversation, why we're asking the question. So if the purpose is to improve programs and services, then the more accurate the results, the better. If it is about surveillance, then I think we need to begin to question why we're asking the demographic questions that we're asking. But we are, trying to advocate as a project and in partnership with our allies to youth program funders so that there can be more inclusive gender questions for youth programs to report back to their funders.
Well, that actually to follow up on that, one of the questions that we have has to do with how do you balance so many choices on your menu with the overall goal of like sort of possibly overwhelming someone with so many choices, but also wanting to honor the possibility of so many identities. When you interpret, especially when you go to interpret the results. And I'm thinking especially when you have write-in results as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a balance in trying to make sure, just like Katie mentioned, really asking that question of why are we including this question if we are, what is the purpose? How are we going to use that information? And I think if I'm reading the question right, maybe including that a gender question is not necessarily impact the results or how you interpret them. And in that case, it may be if it's not providing a lot of information that it doesn't need to be asked. If you are using that to better respond and serve folks that you work with or respect their gender identity, to develop or design more inclusive programming, and for if for general data collection practices, it's maybe not informative. Maybe it is an option to not ask those questions.
I can tell you just for my own personal experience that, having been on boards of directors of agencies that, of course, are usually funding these programs through government funding, that usually it's the government ultimately that wants to know some of this demographic information. So, of course, as a flow-through agency, you have to ask these questions because that's what your funder wants to know. The government ultimately wants to know. And so as, say, the board of directors of a local agency, I mean, I want to know, and I would be happy to know if it's relevant to the program. I would be happy to know the wonderful breakdown through the gender menu if it's necessary. And I'd also be happy to waive the question completely if it's not necessary. But ultimately, my funders, say the Ministry of Health or Community Services or whoever it might be, if they tell me I need to ask male or female, or whatever very restricted gender menu it is that they're using, what can I do? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, of course.
If that's what they're the ones who ultimately control the purse strings, and they're the hard ones to convince.
Yeah. Maybe I'll let Katie answer maybe with the funder perspective, but something I guess as you were sharing, I thought of back to this question, I guess, like from so many choices, and the goal is to honor respondents' identities, and maybe that if you have capacity, of course, if you're going into analysis and reporting, it creates different challenges or requirements, but having an open-ended question where folks are still allowed that self-determination, and then you're, of course, requiring more qualitative analysis, but perhaps providing definitions to allow folks to self-select, and then that may be overwhelming as well, but allowing people to write in their own gender identity. And maybe Katie, if you're able to touch on Trevor's question about funders.
Yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing challenge in the sector, absolutely. I think sometimes if possible, and I know we don't always have the time and space, we're very busy in the work that we do, but to have that conversation with a funder can be impactful, not from a place of being defensive, but, from a space of calling a funder into a challenge. I know that LGBT YouthLine, in a forum that we had with youth program funders, really shared the impacts of the questions that they were asking young people who were accessing their programs and services about their gender had on those young people. And I think hearing that directly from a program was impactful. I think this change is going to take time, in terms of us opening up how we think about gender, how we ask about gender, how we report on the gender identities of our program participants. And I think going back to, maybe understanding why the program funder wants to ask that question as well. Like if it's possible to have a conversation with a funder, to take the time and space to do that, from a place of understanding, why they need to know, and then reporting to them the challenges that you face. Like perhaps there are ways to be constructive around that, but it is something that, we're continuing to try to advocate around, for small and large youth program funders, institutions, foundations, and also government.
And then just in the final minute or so that we have, if you could quickly, maybe if you can quickly address what the process was that you used in coming up with this more inclusive menu. How do you know that it's truly inclusive?
Very good question. And again, humility is very important, both in terms of how we approach this work and how we hope that others will, in the sense that once you are working with young people and you have a sense of what their needs are and how they identify, you can obviously, adjust the inclusive gender menu to fit your context. The process was folks at YouthREX and folks at LGBT YouthLine of different gender identities, having conversations around what we have experienced in working with youth programs, who have had challenges in asking about gender, and also challenges that LGBT YouthLine has faced. LGBT YouthLine is a youth-led organization. And so really understanding the challenges that they've had as a program asking these questions, and also as folks who have to answer these questions. What are the challenges? And then thinking about that very simple, so seemingly simple gender question that we see often with male, female, other, or male, female, trans, and what are the assumptions in that, and having conversations to kind of break that down. That's really what the process was. So engaging folks of different gender identities who have had to engage in filling out forms, who have administered forms, who have supported programs in understanding demographic questions, and then really unpacking and exploring how to do this in a way that's more inclusive, with the knowledge that the work will continue to change, and that the inclusive gender menu we share with you today may look different a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So I hope that's helpful.
I want to thank both of you, Katie and Rebecca. This has been a great presentation, and I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you so much. And don't forget to fill out the survey. The link is in the chat. And everyone, you will find this webinar posted to our website and to YouTube very shortly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.